morning. Hello, my name is Helen Christians, and I'm here with you this morning at the Friendly House. You're here at a Humanists of Greater Portland Sunday morning meeting. And last week, if you remember, Dr. Schmidt began his four-part series, and through just some coincidences, he's here in person this morning. So I would just want to welcome you all to the meeting. We've got a nice crowd here, and I do want to take a moment on this Mother's Day to recognize all the women in our audience today who have given birth to children, and also those that have parented children by loving them, mentoring them, caring for them, protecting them, that are not genetically connected to those children. Our society needs mothers for a healthy, successful society. So you're here at a humanist meeting, and a quick definition of humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It affirms the dignity of all human beings. Humanists believe that this is the only life of which we are certain. And because of that belief, we attempt to live the best life we can envision for ourselves. We do this for ourselves, our family, our friends, our fellow humans, and for all the other living creatures with whom we share this fragile planet. Our topic this morning is the second in a series of 4 lectures under the heading Toward a New World Society. This second lecture, Lessons in History, especially addresses the humanist commitment of global awareness. Lauren, you're a reader this morning, I believe. Are you there? There he is. Oh, Lauren, thank you so much for your willingness to do a reading for us this morning.
Okay. This morning's reading is about humanism and faith. A few years ago, I read an essay with the title Positive Humanism, and here the author complains about a certain aspect of humanism. He accuses humanism of questioning certain aspects of other people's ways of thinking, ways that add color and depth to the human scene. The author asks this question: what becomes of fantasy and imaginative reflection on the maybes and the might have beens that so enrich literature, art, and reflective human thought? I thought this was a good question, so it occurred to me to extend this question to what becomes of religious faith. But first, let's have a look at what it means to have religious faith. What do we mean by that? In chapter 8 of Daniel Dennett's book, Breaking the Spell, he discusses something that he calls belief in belief. I refer to this as professing belief. Now, in light of the question just raised, it may be that for some people of faith, there are maybes and might have beens that enrich their lives in the way that art and literature and generally enrich people's lives. And beyond that, faith may invest people with a crucial part of their identities. Just as with some of us, humanism is an important component of our identities. Some atheists say faith does not make you a better person. But what if it's possible to see religion in the same way that we see poetry, literature, art, and music? No one wants to say that poetry, literature, art, and music do not make you a better person. Well, maybe what is meant is that faith does not make you a morally better person. Of course, this is a different sense of better. But even here, it's quite possible that faith makes some people morally better people. Humanism is about making people better in one important sense, promoting human well-being. Rationalism and critical thinking have a role here, but we need to keep in mind that the starting point does rest in certain core values that involve emotion, intuition, empathy, and subjectivity over and above what we usually think is objective, over and above the rational stuff of empirical science.
Thank you. That was a very interesting reading, Lauren, and much appreciated. You always do such a good reading. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce our speaker, who is well known to this humanist community. He did a marvelous series about 10 years back that we all just benefited from so much. And through a set of coincidences, he's here today. And Dr. Robert Schmidt has a Ph.D. in political science and several graduate degrees in theology. Before his retirement, he was a professor of theology and political science at Concordia University in Portland. Today, he will be continuing his series. This is part 2 of his series, and it's entitled Lessons from History. Welcome, Dr. Schmidt.
When history turns a corner. Some review. We talked last week about fears for our future. We looked at some current fears. And when we looked at current fears, we talked about all that immigration that's happening. It's not only happening here. And we put all that together and we said, what's happening? And we said, are we at the brink of a big change in our world? Where the whole system is changing. And we quoted an Emanuel Wallerstein who said, that's precisely it. He wrote a book called The End of the World as We Know It. Then we looked at the threat to the economy. According to Wallerstein, he said, capitalism is in real trouble. And he said, a couple things are in the works. One is we've always had more people living on the farms than the cities. Now, what happens is there's less people working on the farms. Well, when they left the farm, they provided low-cost workers for capitalism, which enabled capitalism to use low-cost workers to prevent increased profits. And now even in China, which had the great rural revolution, Chinese are trying to pay people to go from the country into the city. And so that's a huge problem for the economy. Who's going to pay for climate change? Ultimately, the people who polluted the climate are gas companies, car companies, and so forth. Are they going to pay for it? Or are we going to have to charge them more taxes so we can pay for it? One way or the other, it's really going to be tough on corporations. Then we said a threat to the nations. The fact that there's so many immigrants really changes what a nation really is. And so we begin to question, what is a Swede when they have a radio program for Tamil people speaking in Stockholm? I think I mentioned that last week. All of a sudden, hey, that's not Sweden. And what was the last one? The last one was, you can't see it, but it was the current contradiction. And the current contradiction is all these are global problems, and the only chance we have to vote is local. As a result, we can't change what's going on in Honduras by voting in America. We go on. Are we in a world transition? Here's a picture of the Assyrian Empire. In Western civilization, and that's all we're addressing, we're not addressing China or Japan. We've gone from tribes to city-states. We've gone from city-states to empires. We've gone from empires to feudalism. And we've gone from feudalism to the nation-state system. Now, these are huge overlapping concepts. A good historian will say, hey, you can't make those kinds of generalizations. But political scientists say, well, why not? we gotta have something to talk about. From tribes to city-states. First, we have the beginnings of Athens and Sparta, Rome and Jerusalem were first tribes. And then they became city-states. We have a chance to see the transition in the Bible with Israel as they went from tribes to city-states. Israel was late in making that transition, and that actually becomes very important. When Israel came into Canaan, almost all of the Canaanitic cities were already city-states. And Israel tried to maintain its tribal identity, which becomes extremely important in the whole history of Israel. City-states were in existence in Palestine before Israel's arrival. And there we go. And so there you have kind of a picture that some people learn about. Here's where Judah was, here's where Issachar was, here's where they were all tribes. And so they wanted actually to keep those tribes. What made Israel different? There's an Old Testament scholar by the name of Norman Gottwald, who as rather surprised kind of the religious community, because he thought that much of the stories of Exodus were probably myth, but that there was some important things that happened at that particular time. And he said what made Israel so much different than everybody else is they had a much more egalitarian society. Other nations had a god, just as Israel did, so Israel was not unique in having their own god. Israel's difference was in its regulations for equality. In fact, Gottwald begins to say that what we have in what really shocks a lot of people, including me, shocks about all that, why do you wipe out all of the Canaanites? That this was really, what should you say, the common people rebelling against tyrannical dictators. And that this was really in part of this thing that was looking for a more egalitarian civilization. In the regulations, you have no permanent slavery. If you had a Hebrew slave, you'd have to release him after 7 years. And at the year of Jubilee, the 50th year, you released all Hebrew slaves. It wasn't perfect, because if you had a slave from another country, they could remain slaves. But at least Hebrew slaves were released. Debts were forgiven. You were not allowed to have interest, charge interest on a loan. This was so that people would not become permanently indebted. And this was kind of a neat thing. They had also land reform. In Leviticus 25, you have the fact that all the land which had been bought or sold in the last 50 years, but would return to the original inhabitants or their descendants. As a result, nobody could accumulate a lot of land because they were charging interest, etc. But you had this common, everybody would have their own land, everybody would have their own vineyard, and so they had a job and a home. And that was kind of guaranteed by the Old Testament law. That, Gottwald says, is terribly unique in the ancient world. Dependence on the moral and religious culture rather than on a central government. This was an idea of limited government in extreme. In other words, you had no central government, no administration, but you did have a moral sense of how you behaved toward one another. And what it was really, the centralizing thing was the temple, or in this case, the tabernacle. And that was what kept the whole country together. Defense depended upon voluntary fighters. Here's the question. The land reform thing probably never worked. And the interest prohibition never worked. As a result, some people got richer and richer, which is normal. And now comes the question. The rich people say, hey, we're being invaded by the Midianites. Grab a gun, got my spear, a sword, and we'll defend. And the poor people are saying, you didn't give me my land back. You charge me interest. You'll fight your own battle. I ain't going out it anymore. All of a sudden, we got a huge crisis. The commentary on the transition is the last of the charismatic people who arose in leadership. They were never elected. They just were there when you needed them. Here was Samuel, the last moral leader. For defense, the people wanted a king and a city-state. Everybody else has got a government. We don't have a government. We got to have a government. And so God and Samuel opposed the demand. Why? Why do you want a government? If you would only do what was right, you don't need a government. They had rejected God as the king, the defender and provider of the tribal alliance. Another king would simply undermine the egalitarian nature of the alliance. If you get a king, he's going to have a draft. There are going to be taxes. These young women are going to have to work at the court and probably become immoral in the process. All these bad things are going to happen if you have a government. A tough transition. Here is the battles that happened under Samuel and Saul and David. The hopes for a better life and a transition to a city-state were dashed. The first kings, Saul and David, had to fight continuing wars. There's great difficulty in setting up a center of government. First it was Shiloh, and then later on, when David captures Jerusalem, it became Jerusalem as the capital. In the struggle between Saul and David, you have the beginning of politics. Before you didn't have that. You had natural leaders arising at the time you needed it, but now you got politics. The divided kingdom. Israel never got as large as you'd ever thought of it, except under Solomon. And there you have little Israel going all the way to Damascus and way down. And this has become the ideal, contemporary ideal even, as to what Israel ought to be. Under Solomon, this is how far they got. Solomon's kingdom and political influence, and it becomes an icon of Israel's hopes to this day. But it was built on conscripted labor against the egalitarian Israeli law. In other words, Solomon was using forced labor. And as a result, a lot of people didn't like this. And Solomon had the reputation of being a wise guy, a very wise man, and he was in some respects. But he was kind of stupid in others. This led to the division of the kingdom. As a result, from here on, there's not a single kingdom, there's two city-states. One's called Samaria, which was the 10 tribes, and the other was Judah, the 2 tribes. From city-states to empires. After the division of the 2 states of Judah and Israel emerged, their history was filled with ups and downs for hundreds of years. After the division, 2 states of Judah and Israel emerged. Their history was filled with ups and downs. However, on the horizon was a total different system shift, a transition from the city-state system to the rule of empires. In this shift, states like Israel, Judah, Moab, Edom, Athens had no future. And that's the extent of the Assyrian system. After Assyria came the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire went into Egypt. It went through much of Asia Minor and to the borders of Parthia or Persia. The city-state of Samaria, Israel, was destroyed by Assyria in 721 BC. Jerusalem, Judah, was destroyed by Babylon in 586. The relocation of the elites, the city-state of Samaria, Israel, was destroyed, and so forth. The relocation of the elites of the conquered territories. Samaria's elite were never heard from again. Some people said, whatever happened to the 10 tribes? Well, the elite were taken, the common people were stayed. Jerusalem's elites, descendants, they did return after 70 years. A commentary on the transition. Here's the commentary of Jeremiah. Weeping Jeremiah, and before him Amos and Isaiah. The devastation of imperial rule was not because of their size, they said. Instead, it was because the rich were stealing from the poor. Sex was being used for profit rather than for the good of families. The prophets were in the tradition of the egalitarian law and the tradition of ancient Judaism. Good news in the transition. The rich who had stolen from the poor were now taken into captivity. after the elite were taken away, the poor got their land back. And so what seemed to be a tragedy turned out to be a blessing. Now they intermarried with people from other nations who were then brought in under imperial policy. And their descendants were later called Samaritans. And hope for the future. Here's a cornucopia of good things, promises for the future. In the most negative parts of the prophets, where probably 85 to 95% of the prophets is devoted to the coming destruction, the terrible things that are going to happen. But there are promises. The promise will be there's going to be finally forgiveness of sins. Though your sins are as scarlet, they're going to be white as snow. There's going to be plenty of good food, and the wine will be of the excellent quality. And there'll be extra water in the desert. The flowers will bloom in the desert. There'll be streams coming through the sand. There'll be healing of the sick, the blind, the lame will leap, the blind will see, the sick will be healed. Liberation of slaves and prisoners like it should have been. Everybody will have their own vine and fig tree, the home and work. There'll be amazing kind of thing that will happen. There'll be peace between nations. There'll be the swords and the plowshares. They won't learn war anymore. Death would be swallowed up. All of a sudden, these hopes begin to generate something in people and have generated them even to this day, as we'll talk about it. But the empires continue. Here's the Persian Empire, which takes over from Babylon and goes all the way to Greece, so that the Persians actually affect Athens, etc. You want to hear about marathons? That's where all that stuff happened. Persia conquers Babylon, invades Greece, and goes as far east as India. It permits the exiles from Jerusalem to go home. Some do and seek to rebuild the temple, but are opposed by those Samaritans. And they're denied the political power to be self-governing. The Greek Empire and Empire as brings persecution. Here's Alexander the Great, and his kingdom goes up to India and has gone all the way back to Greece, of course, and Egypt. He conquers all of Greece, the Persian Empire. Egypt creates the largest empire thus far, but he dies at 33. And then the empire is split in 4 ways. And the Seleucid Greeks, based in Syria under Antiochus, that's where we get Antioch, impose Greek culture on their subjects. They go into Jerusalem and they say, okay, you ought to start worshiping Zeus now. And they totally desecrate the temple and they kill the priests who are important. And that led to the desecration of the temple. And then there's a Jewish resistance organized under the Maccabees. When they finally pushed the Greeks out, that became Hanukkah, which we Jewish people celebrate to this time. Then Rome wins out. Here's the Roman Empire. Roman Empire went from 27 BC to 486 AD, about 500 years. You can see it goes all the way up to Hadrian's Wall at Scotland, and continuing to, it did not go as far as India. In fact, the Romans always had some problems with the Persians. They brought a mode of civilization to more countries than the world had ever seen before. Trade was relatively safe. Trade ensured a fairly high level of prosperity. From empires to feudalism, the next big section. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked Rome in 410 AD. Not long after the Huns, not long after, the Huns conquered much of eastern part of the empire and invaded Italy. In 476, Odoacer, a German in the Roman army, deposed the Roman emperor and then became king of Italy. That year is thought by many to be the mark of the fall of the Roman Empire. Why did Rome fall? Invasions by barbarian tribes. We had the Visigoths and the Huns, etc. Economic problems and over-reliance on slave labor. Interesting, you're bringing up some of those earlier things. The rise of the Eastern Empire in the late 3rd century, and that's in Constantinople, and some of you have heard of Constantine, and so that was the Eastern Empire, and the Western Empire kind of died on the vine, and the Eastern Empire got a little stronger. Overorganization and military overspending, overexpansion, not overorganization. Government corruption, political instability. The arrival on the Huns and the migration of more barbarian tribes. Christianity and a change in traditional values. That became a cultural shift that really changed a whole bunch of stuff. And the weakening of the Roman legions. And here's another commentary. We've had the commentary of Samuel, the commentary of Jeremiah, and now you get the commentary of St. Augustine. He wrote a huge volume. In fact, what we think it is, if he'd be living today, he had a blog. He wrote, I think, over 100 books, and it's all included, and the short books, but it's all included in the City of God. A multi-volume work addressing the sack of Rome in 410. Why in the world did this thing happen? He argues that the fall of Rome was due to the corruption come from the worship of pagan gods. He claimed that the success of Rome in the past was due to God's providence. He also wrote that it was the virtue of Roman legions that had assured civilization and protected Rome. Dealing with Rome's fall. Here's Pope Leo the Great. And he came from the Roman nobility. He met Attila the Hun, and he persuaded him not to invade Rome. It's kind of a historical, interesting point. He was the first bishop of Rome to be called a pope. From a pastoral perspective, he galvanized the charitable works in Rome beset by famines, an influx of refugees, and poverty. He further associated the practice of fasting with charity and almsgiving. The legacy of the empire. Here's the Roman theater in Arles, France, which is still being used. Through the coercive power of, though the coercive power of the empire was gone, its culture enriched coming centuries. Latin became the lingua franca of the Western world's educated people. Roman roads, theaters, baths, and in many cases laws benefited the areas it once ruled. Then came a chaotic transition. From 476 to 458, the period is known as the Dark Ages. There were migrations of various peoples. The Visigoths controlled Iberia, parts of France, and some of Italy. The Franks conquered much of Central Europe. It's estimated that the plague of Justinian killed over 100 million people. And during this time, Rome was said to have less than 20,000 inhabitants. It became a ghost town. Communication and trade are limited. The crumbling of the Roman roads, Transportation is almost stopped with warring populations. Survival depended on local production rather than trade. With the loss of communication with Latin from Roman areas, with loss of communication with Latin from Roman areas, they developed their own dialects. During this time and after, there's the development of French, Spanish, Italian, and Romanian. The church steps up. Here's Saint Benedict and the monastic movement around 500 AD. The Bishop of Rome is now a centralizing figure. There was no other centralizing figure. And so this is why he became that. Monasteries now bring some security and hope to many with charitable hospitality. Bishops with ties to Rome still bring a unifying dimension to chaotic times. Latin now is insisted upon as a unifying language, despite the move to newly developing dialects of Latin. So amongst the educated people, particularly the clergy, and now kings and so forth, you still had to learn Latin. Commentary 2, Augustine More. City of God on Augustine. Augustine makes a break with classical political theory. Plato and Aristotle said basically politics is the natural outgrowth of the human being. And so what I can do as a human being is not much, but if I gather together in a state, then we can do far more. And so the idea that the state would be something positive, etc., was the idea. But of course, Plato and Aristotle didn't allow slaves to be part of the state. Women, they weren't thinkers. They couldn't do it. And so it was us intellectual, free people who could be the state. And that was a positive thing. Augustine said, no, the government is to restrain men's selfish nature. In other words, you got to have somebody to keep order. And so it really kind of changed things. And you can even see some modern stuff coming in and out of this. The city of God, he said now, is better than the city of man, but that requires some explanation. What he meant by the city of God was not necessarily a coercive government. He was thinking more of something where we all got together and did what was right. Going kind of back to that ancient Hebrew idea, you don't need a government, but we could all come together and think well and do good things. And if so, government becomes less important. The church's rule would be better than that of the sinful people. And this becomes very controversial in the future, because now it almost seems to give the church coercive rule, which I don't think was Augustine's original idea, but it's what happened. The Holy Roman Empire. There's Charlemagne. Influenced by Augustine, Charlemagne sought to rule as God's representative. He used coercion to Christianize some of Europe. He was crowned Roman emperor and is considered to be the first, in quotes, Holy Roman Emperor. And following his example, kings throughout the Middle Ages held to the belief in the so-called divine right of kings. Now, if you think this is totally absurd, what did they do with King Charles the other day? They put him behind the screen and they anointed him, huh? The priest anointed him. That goes back to Augustine in an interesting sort of way. It may be ridiculous, but it goes to show history has its roots. Feudalism. Castles were built against marauding armies. If you no longer had a Roman civilization and you had marauding armies, you go to defense. And that's what a castle was. Feudalism was a system for structuring society. around relationships derived from the holding of land, known as a fiefdom or a fief, in exchange for service or labor. United limited trade, localized economy based on agriculture and ownership and tolls. That's why you put castles on the Rhine River, so that you can collect little money for all the boats going by. Wealth was largely produced through serfdom, a type of slavery. Medieval kings of France, England, Spain, and Portugal were relatively poor and dependent on their nobles because they had no real money or centralized administration. If you go to war, you have to borrow money. And you had no taxation and so forth. You lived at the behest of your nobles. Now we're coming to discussion. And we'll have some discussion now, and we'll also have some at the end.
On the Zoom, go ahead, Ranga. Please ask your question.
Okay. What you have been now discussing is mostly relating to Europe and a little bit of the Middle East. But there's a much larger part of the world like India, China, another thing. Now, how did things happen there, and what is the relationship between the two? Can we generalize on together taking all these things? Because otherwise we are only looking at one slice of the world and its history.
Yeah.
That's an excellent question. And I really could not handle the Greek and the the Greek and Indian situation. I've read that in some cases there are some parallels. They had times, but there are some unique features of China, for example. China had empires, and then it had split up into warlords, come back to empires. The invasion of India from people from the north, pushing people down to the south, had its own unique framework. And I had difficulty in doing that. And so I limited myself to Western civilization, and that's a weakness. I acknowledge it. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt. We have a question from Friendly House.
Yes, you mentioned several transitions, the Babylonian transition, the Sumerian transition. What was the actual cause of those transitions? Was it really only a matter of military might and just military takeover of one group by another, or were there more economic or environmental issues involved in some of these early transitions?
That's a study that I really, we had it with Rome, but as far as I know, those studies have not been that thorough, or if they are, I don't know about them. I do know there are some military frameworks, so that when weaponry improved, I believe the Assyrians were one of the first to use iron and steel over against bronze. And so that when you had that, you had a military thing that could be more powerful than the other. But in terms of the social things, what happened, I don't know. From the accounts in the Bible, you have kings with empires who are very proud and so forth, and then Nebuchadnezzar goes mad. And then he comes back to sanity. But outside of that, I don't know much more. Thank you.
Are there any other questions here at Friendly House? Go ahead. I think.
If you look at the money instead of the politics, there's kind of a different picture going on here. There's a recipe book from ancient Rome of 365 recipes, and 340, some of them have hot peppers, which came all the way from the South Seas and Southeast Asia or someplace. So there's trade going a long way, even though the empire doesn't go so far. What what happens to that in the Middle Ages? Did that persist through that period too? Or did that somehow get wiped out?
Some of the trade in Northern Europe, even during the Middle Ages, got picked up by the Hanseatic League. And that was around the Baltic. And so some of that trade happened. Some of the trade that happened to the east was slow, but I think there was some. You have Europe was really looking for things like silk and pepper and whatever. Later on with Marco Polo, there began a little bit of that trade, but that came a little later, I think. So I think that trade was severely hampered. It may still have existed.
Yeah. Now, if you mentioned the Pope
Get
you mentioned
closer.
the Pope talking Attila the Hun into not sacking Rome.
Right.
I've read that at one point the Romans gave Attila a really big pile of gold to not sack Rome, and that could Rome have just fallen because it ran out of money?
Could be.
Any other questions here at Friendly House right now? We'll have time after this part 2. I have a question.
Yes.
What were there any in these empires? It seems it's all male driven, that women never had a role anywhere. Is there any of the empires or the city states that recognize the women as a citizen or a part of the power?
I think there were women who had power over the kings, etc. But they almost always had that indirect role. I think in the Bible, there's Esther,
Mhm.
who persuades her husband not to kill all the Jews. I think that in Rome, you have a whole bunch of very influential women doing things with her husbands so that the husband did this and that. But in terms of actual rulers, there may have been some that I really am unaware of, but
No.
they don't come down in history very
Yeah.
much.
No, and nor have I ever learned of, I just am curious. It just seems so much power in
Right.
men's hands.
Right.
Thank you. Egypt, yeah, maybe some.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Mhm.
Cleopatra.
Yeah.
She was a Ptolemy. She was Greek. She was one of those 4 generals, that Alexander, well, the Ptolemies in Egypt had this curious thing. They always married their sisters. And apparently they had good genes. Cleopatra apparently is quite attractive. So anyway, that was a Greek thing, not an Egyptian thing.
Interesting thing. Thank you. Okay, I
We
think,
go on.
wait, we do have one, it looks like we have one more
One more,
question.
okay.
Renga, go ahead.
Al was talking about trade, but there was trade between Rome and southern India right from the early centuries of Christian era. And there are, for example, the gold and silver used to come to India, and then cotton and other things used to go to Rome. And some of the Roman writers used to write that if we depend so much on this cotton, we will lose all our wealth and things like that. So there was quite a bit of trade right in the early days.
Thank you, Renga.
Good comment.
I see Hank Robb has his hand up. Go ahead, Hank Robb, you go ahead with your question.
Well, I don't think this really has a lot to do with the movement from empire in Europe to feudalism, but you didn't mention the donation of Constantine, which I think is the foundation for the claim of the Pope to have rule in the West.
Right.
Which of course they just made up. I mean, it's completely a fake, but it was the basis of the Pope having control in what was formerly the Western Roman Empire.
Very correct. And we're going to get to somebody who didn't like that idea pretty soon.
Thank you.
We go on. From feudalism to the nation state system. Here's the Black Death from 1346 to 1352. The transition was triggered by the pandemic, according to some. Now that's kind of early, but the results are rather long term. 25 million died. Concurrent deaths were up to 200 million people at that time. In other words, it caused great consternation throughout Europe. Then came the Protestant Reformation around 1500, limiting the power of the church, and the Peasant Revolt. And the Peasants' Revolt really became extremely disruptive in terms of let's kill the nobles, let's kill people in the church, and tear down the churches, clean out the churches from what they thought was Roman Catholic excesses, and so forth. But it was highly disruptive. Order out of chaos. Here's Francis I. But then there was also Henry VIII of England, Charles V of the Habsburgs, and became nationalist and oftentimes internationalist kings. Someone asked me about the Ottoman Empire. That also happened during this particular era, because the Ottoman Empire went as far as Vienna, conquered, was opposed in Vienna, but it happened under the reign of Charles V of Austria, Spain. Feudal lords were weakened, partly with the disruption of the serfs getting away and having some of the tail end of the Black Death and so forth, which has changed things. This allowed the kings to become much more powerful, because before that, as I said before, they weren't that strong. Now they began uniting sections of countries under the concept of the nation. And so here, as I mentioned last week, you have Ferdinand and Isabella putting Spain together. And the Portuguese, of course, were really strong, probably the first one to be strong. And then under Henry VIII, Great Britain begins to be much more centralized and strong. In some cases, Henry VIII taking away the property of the monasteries and using their wealth to centralize his government. A new economic system, capitalism. As the feudal states weakened, cheap labor became available. Cities grew, trade multiplied, and voyages overseas brought back wealth. A new class of people arose whose importance grew. Taken together, their power today equals that of many nations. So Exxon's profits are more than probably 100 nations. So here, now making money through investing and charging interest has become praiseworthy. Before it was damnable, and now it's good. Commentary. Here's Luther. And Luther is upset that bishops would govern provinces and that the Pope would have his own armies and territories in Italy. He taught that there are two kingdoms. Governments are coercive, using force to enforce the laws to protect people. And the church is God's kingdom of grace, which should apply God's word to the problems of sin and behavior. In this split between God's morality and the government, which is able to do things by force, there comes a problem. And the problem happens particularly in Nazi Germany, where there were a lot of Lutherans. And they said, well, the church is for God's grace and goodness, and the government has to do what the government has to do. And so you get Lutheran theologians beginning to say, well, Hitler's okay. But there's a couple of Lutherans, like one, maybe you have heard his name, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was on the plot to kill Hitler, and he disagreed strongly with Luther. And he said, wait a second. He says, there's only one morality. And some of it comes through the church and some of it comes through the state. And so states ought to behave morally, even though they don't happen to be religious. And all of a sudden, you have a different idea of, maybe going back to Augustine in one sense, that the state, I mean, the so-called city of God is not just about God, it's about everything, and it's not necessarily coercive. It could be something much softer, and we're going to develop this much more in the next couple lectures. Then come the religious wars. 30 Years' War in Central Europe, Catholics and Protestants in France, Catholics and Protestants in England. In 1648, Europe brings some peace. Europe brings some peace. I should have the convention brings some peace to Europe, which happened in 1648. Cuius regio eius religio, whoever rules the country determines the religion. And that became kind of the way in which you solve some problems. So that in Germany, for example, you had northern Germany was largely Lutheran and Calvinist, and they ruled that way because the princes were that way. In southern Germany, largely Catholic princes, and so you have Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, they're far more Catholic. Italy, of course, would be Catholic. Spain would be Catholic because of Elizabeth I. England is Protestant. And so you begin to say, whoever rules the country, that's the way the religion ought to be. Separation of church and state for slightly different reasons. Here is Jefferson and Madison. Colonies were sometimes denominational. Maryland was good for Catholics, Pennsylvania for Quakers, Puritans, of course, in Massachusetts. And it would be a good idea to separate church and state in the Constitution designed to limit religious conflict. Issues like school prayer, taxation of church property, abortion continue to provoke debate, even in a place where we have traditionally separation of church and state. Current culture wars ask the question whether America is a so-called Christian nation. And you know some of the fallout of what's going on right now. A modern identity. Here's an American family. Many identify themselves as Americans from a Christian nation, having achieved the American dream through hard work and good investing. The same could be true, however, of identities of Hungarians, Poles, French, and British. Threats from immigration, inflation, climate change, and war bring fear to absolutely everybody. Now, here's a little summary. Kingship and system change. I could have changed that to governance and system change. And here we're looking at the commentators, people who made comments on those transitions. So from tribes to city-states, they rejected God as king, or putting it in a secular term, they rejected the limited government idea, where you were ruled more by moral concerns than by coercion. Because they did not free the slaves and they didn't give land back to the owners, the poor would not defend the rich. Then from city-states to empires, the city-state kings were often ungodly, or we would put it in a secular term, they were often bad. Because people sold the poor for a pair of shoes, they did not have really a moral basis. 3, from empires to feudalism, the city or kingdom of God is better government than that of men. Connected to the rule of God or the rule of morality, governments would be much better. From feudalism to nation states, there really are 2 ways of governing. The state should not impose religion on its citizens, nor should the church exercise coercive power. But the question is it possible to separate them? Particularly if you're talking about should governments be moral? And here, next time, we look at coercion versus consensus on a world basis, and look at paths to the future, change, and hope. Okay.
Wonderful.
I didn't expect you to announce this to the group. I just put it in chat. It's about the peoples that the Romans were calling barbarians. And the late Terry Jones, who was a trained historian, in addition to being a comedian, talks about how, in fact, the Visigoths, the Huns, the Gauls, and the Franks actually were well ahead of the Romans in many ways, and technologically. And he explodes some of the myths that people thought, all these were just terrible people raining down the ultra civilized Romans. So it was just
That's a good point. And some people have argued the Native Americans here were really far advanced than the British and French who conquered them.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, even environmentally, they were way ahead. It's just that the way history has been told, it has oftentimes followed the ruler and the people who had power versus the people who were ruled.
Yeah.
And so what happened to the Arawak Indians in the Caribbean? They're totally disappointed.
Right.
Disappeared. So.
I mean, look at the Cherokee Indian. I mean,
Right.
they were farming. They had a language that they even
Right.
became a written language eventually.
Right.
But I didn't learn about that as a child. All
Right.
the natives were wild, just savages. Any questions here at Friendly House? Go ahead, Dakota. There we go.
Good. This is where, yes. Good morning.
Morning.
My question is a brief one, and I take the risk of it being answered in the next lecture. But basically, it's with all that history, lessons from history we can get, and how closely they were tied to religion. With more of the world becoming, at least on the whole, more secular now, do you think that that trajectory that we're going towards, if we have a singular one, is better or worse for that secularism? And if so, if we're doomed to it, or if we're not doomed to it, then is it possible for a different route, or is it sort of set, do you think? And is it set, and how dependent is that on individual religion? If that makes sense.
If you're asking about the future, one of the people that I've been doing the most with is Emanuel Wallerstein, who's a social scientist, and he sounds sometimes like he uses a Marxist critique of capitalism, etc. But one of the places where he disagrees sharply with Marx is that there's any kind of pattern of history. And he says, basically, we don't know what's coming next. That he says, out of the smallest little thing that happens in history, you can have a whole development, but that we can't see that right now. He said one of the things that he's alarmed at is that almost all of us have certain ideas of progress. He doesn't believe in progress. He says that we don't know where it's going. And so if I were to follow him, then I would basically say the shape and direction of what's going to happen, secular, religious, poetic, we don't know. Economic. Now, there are some people who could say, wait a second, what about technology? That certainly has formed a progressive kind of thing. We are no longer doing horses, we're doing cars, we're doing airplanes, we're doing all kinds of, and it's just now we're doing artificial intelligence. Things are just taking off. We don't know how it's going, but it's probably going to change things. But how we know how it's going to work, we don't know.
Wanted to recommend a book and then ask a question. Can you hear me? I just finished a book called The Princes of Ireland. Slogged my way through it, the first half, because there's so much Celtic names and everything. But it reaffirmed to me, and I am leading to a question, that there is just an innate thing in the genes of human beings to always want more, that as it shifts to the people in power, then they go to war. And it's just gone on from ever and ever. And the thing I liked about this book and your lecture today is just over the top for it. It's just the history. Ireland is a microcosm of what you've described today in all of Europe. And that book showed that to me. But what do you think about this idea that humans will always be at war?
What do I think about the idea that humans will always be at war? Historically, they always have been. However, there have been huge sections in where the wars have not been that bad. Also, one of my professors, Modelsky, basically said, we have global wars that come every 100 years or so. But in between time, we have periods of relative peace. Unfortunately, Modelsky said that we're just about due to another world war. That the last world wars was basically, he says World War I and World War II were one war, that they never really finished. As a result, that was from 1918 to, we're coming near to 100 years, a little bit more than that, but we're kind of due. And he said world wars are about changes in the system. And so what's alarming really about China, for example, and China and Russia, they want to change the economic system. They said, why should we do things on the dollar when we could do something different? And all of a sudden you're saying, oh, that's why people fight world wars. If you can keep world wars from happening, you'll save most of the people. I mean, huge numbers of people. Whether we can stop little wars, that's tough. So I kind of think that we're going to continue to have them. I dread that. But oftentimes in these system shifts, and if we're in for one, we're going to have a period of chaos. And that frightens me a little bit. Whether that is conflict, war, or simply poverty, I don't know. But I'm not very, I'd like to skip this.
There's a comment from Leslie. One thing we know of the future is depletion beyond sustainability, unless we learn to get beyond capitalism, that we're in a shift. Another book recommendation is Myths of America, or Myths America. Okay. Ringa, you had another question.
Yeah. This is to say that we have been talking about, kings and churches and big powers, but, throughout the history, we had individuals coming in and creating some sort of a, revolutionary change, and then went into a very completely political changes. For example, one prime example is that of Muhammad. He's a single person. From that, there's a huge change came all over the world. And similarly, there have been philosophers and religious leaders, who claim that the mankind can improve, irrespective of the kingdoms or kings or states. For example, in recent years, you might have heard of Aravind Ghosh. He's one of the philosophers. He was of the view saying that he has a big ashram in Pondicherry, where a lot of international people gather, and that is the man can improve and then become a superman in future. So it is not just all connected only with states and kings and centralized power. So lot of individuals coming up can really change the world and make big changes even.
Rango, I think your question was, can one individual make significant change? Am I correct?
I definitely agree with that point of view, as does this Emmanuel Wallerstein, that you can have something happen which changes the whole direction of everything. It may be an individual, it may be an event, but it's something which is kind of open. Interestingly enough, Wallerstein says we ought to give a new view of what he calls utopistics, which is the science, which is the creation of an idea, which would really be great. He's a social scientist who says, unfortunately, social science has been tried to be value-free, to be more scientific. And in doing so, has really split knowledge from morality. And he said, what we ought to do is think of what we really want morally or for the good of everything, and then use social science to get there, which I thought was kind of an interesting point of view.
Yeah.
And so it begins to do away with that split between knowledge and good, and now saying, let's imagine poetically the good, and then use science. How do we get there?
To get there. Great idea. Dakota, you have another question.
Oh, yeah, yes.
Of course.
Actually, I had a different one, but now that I hear that I actually have a smaller one. My smaller question about what you just said is, and it seems the biggest problem in that is, how do you get people to agree on what is good in the first place? Is how does that consensus happen?
Could you repeat that? I'm having a hard time hearing.
My question was basically about what you had just said, is how do you build consensus on that definition of the good in the first place, you know? Because if we can't agree on that, then we will still end up chasing different projects.
Right. For example, I think there are a couple of things that we have come to agreement on. We're going to get much more on this in the last session. But the UN has basically millennium goals that they said, okay, this is what we're looking for in terms of maternal health. This is what we're looking for in terms of world hunger. And we go through all those things and we say, okay, let's aim for that. Let's see if we can get that. And I think, hey, we can agree on that stuff. I'm also going to get into the fact that there's a global ethic. Hans Küng, Tübingen, gathered together leaders from all the major religions and humanists and came up with what we think ought to happen to our globe. And so you have this global ethic. I think I've talked about this 10, 15 years ago in this room, but I'm going to repeat that because I think it's very necessary to understand there are things we have already agreed on, which put up there and say, how do we get there?
Thank you. We'll listen. We'll have 2 more of your lectures, so I'm sure we'll have some of those answers. Thank you. Joyce, go ahead.
People are recommending quite a few books to you today. I don't know if you're familiar with Rianne Eisler's The Chalice and the Blade, but she argues that there's throughout history, even in prehistory, there's been a struggle between the feminine and the masculine, the idea of partnership versus dominion. And she's seeing that we may be moving toward a kind of future balance. I look at all the women leaders around the world right now and the way things are changing. Do you see any possibilities for that kind of an egalitarian, or is it she says it's not utopian, but is it?
Well, I'm not against utopianism.
You talked about agreeing on what you want and then doing it. We have the example of, if I take 2 characters out of your talk, of Luther and the Pope agreed. They got together. They massacred the Huguenots. It's still a holiday in France. How do Chairman Mao knew what he wanted. He tried to convince Khrushchev into starting a nuclear war because we'd only lose 300 million people on our side, and the capitalists don't even have 300 million people.
When you hook up utopianism and coercion, you got their point. But what if you hooked up utopian versus what we might call soft power? Maybe that changes things.
Okay.
But I think what you're arguing against is you're arguing against a coercive kind of framework where you're forcing your ideas on top of somebody else. On the other hand, we're always going to have disagreements. But if you have this in a soft power relationship, so that we begin to say, wait a second, there's ways in which I'm going to do something, and maybe if that influences you, that's wonderful.
Oh, Hank has a hand up. Okay.
Just one comment. I can't remember who it was who comes after Confucius in China, but he's a unifier of the place. And his words are, everyone will love everybody else or else. But I really want to comment on your analysis because it seems to be a little off to me. The nation state of Spain was an empire. The nation state of Portugal ran an empire. All of it doesn't, it seems to me the real question is how much control of land and population can be under one group of people. That's really what has gone on throughout our history. The size of populations and landmass that can be controlled by one group of people.
You're talking, I was generalizing, and your critique is right. I was generalizing about nations versus feudalism, and was not talking about its external things. But you're right. It is empire was a Portuguese empire and a Spanish empire, and that really was quite something different. But it begins to compare sea power wise with the empires of old, and then later on the British Empire. You have that's a different framework than I've been using, but it's really a worthwhile thinking about because it changes, in a certain sense, what should I say? What modern the world has become. And so out of those empires, we've got tremendous division between what could be, say, the core areas, rich areas, the peripheral areas, the poor areas, and the semi-peripheral, which is the Korea, Taiwan, and so forth. That really reflects a different kind of analysis, which I should pursue sometime.
Thank you.
Dr. Schmidt, I think we have come to the end of our time.
Wonderful.
So thank you so much